Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to this episode of Table Talk, a series of conversations with writers and academics who write and work on human-animal relations. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan. My co-host Anu is also here. The Indian Animal Studies Collective aims to bring together academics and writers who are working on animal-related issues in India. Today we have with us Lauren Van Patter. We're going to discuss her essay on more than human everyday urbanism, rhythms and sensoria in the multi-species city. The talk is going to be recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube, but it is a very informal discussion. If you want to ask any questions at any point, feel free to jump in. And sometimes participants in the talk wait till the end, but please do not hesitate, especially if there's an associated question that comes to your mind. Lauren, I thought we could begin the discussion by talking a bit about how coyotes are perceived in your city. Um, the reason I was interested in your essay is because, similar to coyotes, there's a lot of negative attitudes and a lot of discussion about street dogs in India. But from when I read your essay, I felt like you were saying a bit more than we should change the negative attitudes of people. So I was curious about what you felt, what you saw about coyotes, and what you thought is what's needed.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Coyotes, I was drawn to them as a case study species for my research for a few reasons. I had done previous work on feral cats, and I felt some of the sort of social contention and the discourse around coyotes was similar to cats in terms of the urban imaginary and how we think about belonging, who belongs and doesn't belong, and who is a threat and how, and some of the biopolitics there. Um, but I would say that there's a lot of divergent opinions about coyotes here. And I think because of how contentious they are, this is why we see them in the news all the time. There's a lot of dialogue in sort of neighborhood groups and things like that around coyotes. And I do think there are folks who are really, quite open to cohabiting with them in some ways and see them as like an interesting part of urban ecology here. But I mean, that can lead to some issues as well. I think there are people who want to have that proximity. And so there are also practices like feeding, which can have, consequences for their behavior and how they end up being perceived and future interactions with humans. But there are a lot of folks who have a very real fear and feeling like they don't belong in the city. And so, a lot of this surfaces when we think about, what makes a problem animal, or in this case, when is a coyote's behavior problematic? When do particularly like the municipal governments feel like they need to intervene and remove an individual? And so how that understanding of conflict or problematic behavior gets defined, I think is sort of central to the issue. And for some individuals, even just seeing a coyote in their neighborhood is enough for them to think like this is a problem and this shouldn't be happening. And there's a very real fear. But that's not how everyone feels. So I think this is why it becomes, such a site of contention. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about the parallels with the street dogs there.
Yeah, I think this thing about fear is definitely something that is genuine because it is definitely felt and experienced. And it's something that, you can't really force on people, especially even when we're talking about education. How do you educate adults to get over their fear? And that's why I was interested in thinking a bit about when you talk about the sensoria and how coyotes are part of the multi-species city. And even in that video with which you opened the essay, the Modest Mouse music video, even just, I haven't ever seen a coyote, but just generally the perception is of them as beings who can snatch babies or attack small dogs. And in contrast, here's a being who's riding the train and who's relaxed in the urban environment. That kind of contrast. Uh, is this contrast, has this contrast, or is this way of occupying the city, is it not known to people, do you think? Because at least in the case of street dogs, because they're a public presence, what they do is available to everyone. But in the case of coyotes, what do you think is happening?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And I think, part of the important context here is that they are relative sort of newcomers to this part of the continent. And so I know there's some folks in the United States who've done work looking at, perceptions in the western part of the country where there have been coyotes for, obviously for a very, very long time, versus the eastern part of the country where they're sort of newer, you know, more newly inhabiting that area, and that there is a difference in this perception. And I think here as well, seeing them as not quite belonging because they haven't always been here is part of the discourse, I think, as well. But I also think, yeah, that that's an interesting point that you make between this, um, yeah, this I guess imaginary around either going to you know, be attacking, babies and this dangerous sort of coy wolf that we have, and that sort of distinction between, you'll see videos come up online and sort of go viral of a coyote playing with a dog in someone's backyard, or going in their backyard and finding dog toys and throwing them around and just acting so much dog-like, or even stories of people, rescuing stray dogs and, taking them in their car and then later finding out that it's actually a coyote puppy and they thought it was a domestic dog. So I think there's something interesting there about them being perceived as so other and wild and threatening, and yet at the same time so close to the domestic dogs that people are very happy to be closely cohabiting with. And that, also here, statistically, there are many more kind of bites and injuries that happen as a result of domestic dogs when compared with coyotes, which is a risk people are, I think, quite happy to sort of live with and manage. But when it comes to the wild canids, there's not that same willingness. And so I think there is that interesting distinction. And then also this point of visibility, I think, again, there's research showing that, coyotes become more nocturnal in urban areas, and they do sort of modify their behavioral patterns in an effort at avoidance. And so there are a lot of folks who live with coyotes very near them and have no idea, right? Because you don't see them, and they're good at keeping hidden and protecting themselves and their family for the most part. And that's why I think it's seen as so anomalous when they are really visible and present in a space, because that's, I think, very much not the norm. But there's lots of reasons why that can happen. But it can very much induce fear in folks, even though they may not know they've been living alongside that family for many years.
And just a related point, I think in the beginning of the essay, you talk about how even when city planners want to support biodiversity in cities or urban spaces, they are thinking about species and biodiversity in the case of the specific species. And you talk about, I think you quote Claire Palmer, who says the focus should be instead on individual relations. And again, I was thinking about coyotes because on one hand, they're seen as this kind of species to be scared of. But on the other hand, there are these individual sightings that happen, and very rarely, I suppose, in groups. So then what kind of individual relations are we thinking about? I'm curious because, again, street dogs too, but also in India, there's a lot of fear now emerging about pigeons in cities. Pigeons is transmitting diseases. Do not feed pigeons, do not engage with them. There's something to be feared and they're very dangerous. So again, I get this distinction. It's important to focus on the individual as opposed to them being a swarm. But what is the individual that we're thinking about?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I can see it with pigeons as well, and sort of I guess how things become perceived as a threat in various ways, whether it's through disease transmission or whether it's through personal safety and attacks like coyotes. But I think again, there's this imaginary of who or what coyotes are in this case. And so much of that, when I talk about sort of the soundscapes and that like this like oral or acoustic ecologies in the city. Um, but there's always this perception that even if you hear only, two coyotes calling, that there've been folks have looked into this, and there's this a common perception that it seems like there's this huge pack that's descending on the city, and that they're calling in the pack or celebrating some sort of hunt or something like that. And so there's all these sort of, like, I think, cultural narratives, but also this very visceral sort of sense of encounter that happens through that. And there's something to do with this perception of the pack. And I think, again, part of this restoring of the kind of the everyday and the mundane is that a lot of the community scientists I was working with and environmental educators were really trying to undo some of that narrative and say, if you really understand, like, they live in small family groups, and even when it sounds like there's lots, there's probably sometimes two parents and maybe a few pups who might be calling together. But yeah, just kind of understanding what they're doing and why as individuals in the city can kind of undo some of that perception of the pack, or the swarm. But I mean, I think, again, back to your point, there is, there's sort of this distinction between real fear and risks, which I don't want to minimize. I mean, people who have had altercations with their domestic dog, while out with a coyote, and that there's very real fear there. But I think often it's sort of trying to counter that, imagined cultural narrative of what is to fear and why, which I think, yeah, I think a focus on the everyday and the individual can help to undo a lot of that.
Cool.
I see there's a hand as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm really enjoying your talk. I haven't read your paper, but it sounds really interesting. I wonder, have you considered, when it comes to the factors contributing to this imaginary around coyotes, have you thought about the narratives that existed, like pre-existed the city, the emergence of modern cities, going back to, for example, in America, I'm part of the Ute tribe in Colorado and Utah, and the Native Americans consider the coyote to be their ancestor along with the wolf, but they regard the coyote as a sort of trickster, a being that should be distrusted, and I think that there are factors in that are non-modern or pre-modern or whatever you want to call it that contribute to that perception. But I was just wondering if you've thought about like larger mythologies or narratives around coyotes that feed into that imaginary.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you so much for that. And I do, I am aware of some of the work around coyote first person narratives, and coyote as trickster from indigenous cosmologies of Turtle Island. Um, I think that's something that, yeah, very interested to learn more about, how that could sort of feed its way into how coyotes are conceptualized and encountered. And I think, in my where I live here, coyotes are relative newcomers, and so uh, the the stories here, again, wouldn't quite be the same. I'm thinking of I guess what I know from folks I've been able to learn here from Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee individuals around coyote being a newer inhabitant to these lands, so they're not being the same sort of understandings in this part of the country. But yeah, I think that's an important point to think with. But I'm not sure how much understandings of, as you were saying, coyote as trickster might sort of permeate the sort of settler city consciousness. But I'd love to learn more about that if there's anything else that you're able to share, or any direction you could point me in as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure where you would start, but it is interesting to think about the difference between a new experience of the animal and
Yeah.
one that's been long standing, um, being able to identify with it versus seeing it as a stranger.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I do think here as well, understandings of like who the Eastern coyote is very much comes into it. And there's, again, this narrative around the coy wolf, that the coyotes that are in the eastern part of North America are hybrids with the Algonquin wolves. And I think, again, the sort of the biopolitics of this understanding of who that creature is and what that makes them, uh, yeah, there's definitely important and contentious points there, and people feel like the kind of coy wolf narrative has potentially done a lot of harm to understandings of coexistence because of the fear of the wolf, which is somehow a bit different. But yeah, it's really interesting point. Thank you.
Anu, do you want to add? Yeah.
Susan. Hi, Lauren. I really enjoyed looking at your article, and there are so many things that Susan and I were excited with and about because we're both thinking a lot about street dogs in India. And to come back to your question in response to Susan's first question, where you said you'd be interested in knowing a little more about the parallels that we see between coyotes there and street dogs here. And Susan's already mentioned this sort of an increasing climate of fear. And we've talked briefly also about the negative portrayal in the media, which is obviously also feeding into this fear among people who may not have had it otherwise. People have been writing since a while now already, and they use this phrase called street dog menace or stray dog menace. So that's been the positioning in the popular discourse, so to speak. But at the same time, when I think of coyotes there and street dogs here, I have the feeling that though both animals are liminal, they are liminal in different ways, or maybe liminal to different degrees as well, which probably does something to the very different ground realities and to people's relations with them. Street dogs have been around way longer in India. And as you pointed out, coyotes in cities is a relatively newer phenomenon. So this proximity hasn't been there that long. Street dogs here tend to also occasionally sleep in people's courtyards or in their shops or at the entrances of people's homes. They are also fed by people. But not in the way that you mentioned about, food being left out for coyotes. The street dogs are also hand fed by people because they are really used to human presence. And so I think that the sort of basic point of departure is not necessarily identical, but of course there are a lot of parallels when we think about how they are being positioned, how they are being written about, how they are being talked about, and how their presence in cities is something that needs to be taken into account, which is point you're making as well. And it's a question that Susan and I think about a lot as well. Instead of pretending as if they're not there or imagining a future in which they would not be there and the city would be sanitized of their presence, we feel as well that urban planning and conceptualizations of these spaces in cities should be multi-species in nature and not anthropocentric. That said, I was interested in knowing how your concept of more than human urbanism would compare with, let's say, Yamini Narayanan's concept of subaltern animism. as a model for exploring the lives of street dogs in Yamini's context, where she locates these dogs at the intersection of colonial biopolitics and informality. And how, to what extent is this included in your idea of more than human urbanism? And in what way does it go beyond that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you. And I'm a big fan of Yanini's work and that paper as well. It's been a while since I've sort of sat with those thoughts, but I really appreciate appreciate that perspective on subaltern animism. I think that I think that there are certainly a lot of parallels when it comes to that perspective on street dogs and what we see with coyotes here, but also I think some differences. And I think a lot of it has to do with, what are we aiming for with the cities that we're creating? And as you were saying, these sort of efforts towards purification of the, exclusively human or the modern human space, and the idea, the ways that particular other than human bodies or communities become welcomed or excluded from the city. And again, it's sort of aligning with, often these biopolitical frames around what is useful, what is contributes either. Again, you can think about the sort of emotional labor of companion animals and the way that they become valued in the home, or else here what you see increasingly are things like backyard chickens. So there is sort of this animals who provide that other kind of metabolic labor or other things like that in the city that are made useful in particular ways. And then I think when it comes to urban planning in the part of the world that I'm in, there's a lot of dialogue around ecosystem services and, how non-human nature can be involved in things like, greening for air pollutant removal or flood protection, or like all of these ways that we can put nature to work to protect us in cities. And so I think, again, things that run counter to that are constructed as not or both not being useful to us in those particular ways, or else posing a risk, again, as we're saying, through things like zoonotic diseases. And I think, again, coyotes as they're not rare, they're not being, conserved for any particular way. There's this real perception of abundance that leads them to be seen as sort of pest or surplus and not really valuable. And there are efforts sort of from, again, the environmental educators or community scientists I was working with to really like restory what they do around ecosystem services, that they're, rodent control and things like that. So people are trying to kind of put them to work in cities in that way. And I'm curious, to hear a bit more, because there's this, I think, this domestic kind of wild distinction that we see here very clearly, and even public and private property plays, again, when you talk about the settler colonial city here, like the public versus private property distinction, I think is huge. And the way people, I guess the level of comfort people have in encountering coyotes in spaces that they perceive as like natural. Like if they're walking in a ravine and they see a coyote, that is such a different response than if they're in a, like what they perceive as a very urban space, or especially like in their own yard or on their own property, or, coming on their porch or something like that, that's suddenly a very different encounter. So I think, this distinction of private property and of, the sort of domestic sphere plays a large role. And I feel like maybe there's a bit more fluidity with the street dogs in your case. But again, I'd love to hear a bit more about your thoughts on any of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking like it's such an enrichment what you've done in your work in terms of also given the fact that coyotes are not very visible, not as visible as street dogs, for example. And so, how do you find them? How do you get to know about them? And how do you come in contact with their placemaking? And I thought it was really wonderful how the oral and the olfactory is sort of brought in trying to understand how their life worlds function, how they perceive space, how they make place. And that, of course, um, that makes me also wonder because you mentioned one particular researcher with whom you worked who was able to pick up scents way more than, let's say, the average human would. And I wonder if this is something that can be that can be learned in the sense that is this just going to be a few really exceptional people? So I feel that people who live in close proximity with non-human animals tend to pick up certain of these qualities, because they learn just to see the world through the non-human other's eyes or nose or ears or whatever. But are these things that can be worked upon, that can be integrated? Because Yamini has also sort of spoken about the need for us as humans to conceptualize space in a more multi-species way. But I feel what she's talking about is more in tune with our primary way of perceiving the world, which is by looking at it. And you're going 2 steps further because you're bringing in other non-anthropocentrically aligned ways of grasping the world, seeing, not seeing, but perceiving the world, making the world. And how can this be incorporated? How can this be inculcated? Do you think it'll just be a few gifted individuals who will be able to do this? Or is this something that would work?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it really was, those experiences were sort of my entry point in thinking through a lot of this. Being out with this community scientist collaborator and yeah, just noticing so much of the learning to sort of to track or to perceive coyote space. Again, for me, I'm always looking for visual cues or occasionally listening, but yeah, watching her sort of smell her way around the urban forest was such a different experience. And so I do think that I do think it's something we can learn to tune into in the same way, again, also with learning to decipher birdsong by ear without having to see birds. These are skills I think we can yeah, we can spend time with folks who have that knowledge and are willing to share and develop those skills ourselves. But I do think you're right that there are some individuals who just, I don't think I will ever be able to train myself to smell the things that she was picking up on. But I think that's why, I mean, it's wonderful being out with different people sort of on the land and learning, because I do think what different people will perceive and what they might be able to teach, we can sort of be sharing in those skills and yeah, dwelling in that place imaginatively by hearing from other people's perceptions. And I feel like I hear about this from people who go out with their, like, for instance, with their dogs in spaces and really attuned to what they seem to be picking up on. And can there be a sort of multi-species apprenticeship there, in a way of like, what captures their attention, and how can we imagine why that might be? And even though obviously we can never have the same sort of sensory, like olfaction as dogs would, we can still try to sort of pay attention to what they're paying attention to while we're out, and maybe pick up on bits and pieces here and there. And I think, again, efforts in that direction towards imagining how other species are also experiencing places, yeah, can really help us. Sorry, am I frozen?
Yeah, I
Yes,
think
your video is frozen.
So sorry. I'm back. I think my internet cut out.
I was just thinking about what Cooper had said earlier and what Anu asked you about this history of the coyotes in a particular city or a space. And even in the case of street dogs, what makes it so difficult is there is no mythological history associated with them, and that they are so closely related to urbanization, um, which makes it, I'm not sure why it is more difficult then, but I wanted to know if your project, if this essay, this focus on rhythms and sensoria is an attempt to kind of mythologize or provide some kind of history to the coyotes who live in a particular space.
Yeah, thank you. To be honest, I think that the focus of what I was really trying to do, I think did very much come out of the everyday and the material and the here and now. And if anything, I think um could um yeah, as Cooper was suggesting, be more sort of in touch with the histories of, kinship with coyote here. I don't think that's something that really came into my work while I was doing this case study, but I think you're right that that's an important, yeah, I think that's an important part of maybe understanding the relationships or working towards, again, more of a coexistence grounded in understandings of kinship. But
Is
I
it
don't, yeah,
Is
go ahead.
there a lack of history besides, let's say, the negative perceptions of coyotes? Is there any other history that is available with regards to coyotes? Because, when it comes to street dogs, it's about rabies and about them being in spaces where people don't want them. In a way, that is their whole identity, in a sense. Is it the same for coyotes? Is there a history that is something else?
I would say, and yeah, again, maybe Cooper can speak more to this as well, but I would say that yeah, that you're right with the eastern coyote, with the coy wolf. Again, there is such a different narrative, I think, and it is very much grounded in this understanding of very recent hybridization and like increased mobility. And so you're right. I think that that sort of cultural and historical understanding is very different than what you would see in Western coyotes range, and the relationships there that again may be more sort of traced back through indigenous ways of knowing about coyote. But I'd love to hear Cooper's thoughts as well.
Go ahead, Cooper.
Yeah, I guess I'd just add that there are different levels of kinship that we can imagine. And a so-called indigenous perspective can help us see how animals are not just our contemporary kin, like we're descended from the same ancestor, but maybe um, pretty much in a literal way. Um, there's really no distinction between a present and a past being in a mythological sense. The time of mythology is outside of historical time. So in a mythological sense, the coyote is our predecessor or ancestor, one that comes before us. And I think with that idea comes a little bit of humility because we realize that humans are not first, that animals come before, and then we arrive as guests or as descendants or whatever. But at the same time, we're siblings. We're kin in the sense of having a sort of horizontal relationship in the present, and so those two different layers or levels of kinship, I think, should be thought together without contradiction, because one gives us more humility, and the other, I think, leads to empathy. And so I feel like the historical, symbolic, mythological point of view can always um, it can add to our current like maybe scientific or empirical point of view without, being an alternative necessarily.
I think in the case of coyotes, I'm not sure about the coyotes, but at least in the case of street dogs, the problem is precisely that such a history is not available. Like in the case of cows in India, there is so
Yes,
much that can be used to cultivate such a connection, and such connections are cultivated. But in the case of street
right.
dogs, in the absence of histories, what do you then do? And if the histories that are being built are negative, then what can then one do about it?
In that case, I think that there is a need to create a story. Not necessarily out of nothing or like it's not fiction, but to look at the world and see how things really are. And in in this case, I would say that we're still related to coyotes, whether we like it or not. Even if that leads to many negative perceptions, we we should acknowledge our kinship and recognize that we're all surviving together in an urban space or not urban. And it it's that space that determines how we live. And so because it's thought of primarily for humans, coyotes and street dogs are left out, but they still live. And so they have to find a way to, cope with the structure that's in place. And so regardless of our feelings about them, they're here to stay as long as they can.
Uh, then we also have a speculative question in the comments from William, who asks if coyotes stopped fearing men, what would happen, and would that be better? And whether this heuristic of fear is that beneficial or detrimental?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think there's this, I'd love to hear others' thoughts too. But for me, I'm sort of thinking through this difference between like fear and boundaries. And this is something that came up a lot to me with the community scientists I was working with, that they would say, for instance, people trying to use things like humane hazing or like aversion conditioning to like reestablish those boundaries in a case where an individual might have been, fed and be more comfortable around humans. And sort of seeing, their narrative was that this is like a compassionate intervention towards healthier boundaries so that we can all keep living together, right? But it really has to do with human tolerance, right? Because, if people are fearful with coyotes being too close to them, or even just like seeing them or them being quite visible in spaces, and then there's this question, can we reshape that behavior so that they're less visible? Really, it's establishing a boundary that's going to let them continue to live, not because it's best for them, but because as soon as they become perceived as a problem, then they are, made killable very often and lethally removed. But obviously those interactions are, I'm sure, encountered as fearful by the coyotes. So this question of like compassion and fear and boundaries and, how that coexistence is sort of like actively made. Um, because I think, yeah, I think that's a good question. We can sort of think about like ideal futures of coexistence if people were more tolerant towards, co-presence and sharing space. But then there's also sort of the messy here and now where that isn't the reality. So what interventions can we do to sort of have these boundaries that enable like a less than perfect cohabitation? But I would love to hear any thoughts that you have as well.
I thought in the article, when you talk about how the coyotes have modified their behaviors according to when people drop their children to school, it's almost like they know more about us and than we know about them. And so it's like we are maintaining these boundaries and thinking of them as wild, whereas they're already really using the city and doing what they want, still remaining invisible to us. And in such a case, and I think that's really at the heart of your article about how the rhythms of the city, is it more than just an adaptation of coyotes as a species? Is it a species behavior, or is it also individuals being in the city? Because I had this conversation with a student who was like, but don't all animals adapt, as if, it's just an evolutionary ability or capacity that animals possess. But of course, that would take us away from what's happening in the city, the rhythm of the city.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. And I would say that in my perception or opinion is that there's a lot of individual level learning and probably trial and error and experimentation and then passing on that knowledge. And so is that cultural, different, like coyote cultural knowledge of how to live in cities? Because I think, yeah, again, one of the things that I found surprising to learn as I was learning about coyotes was that, you might have a way of imagining what life is like for them. And again, coming back to this like fear and trying to navigate all of the challenging, landscape of car traffic and like off-leash dogs, and then, humans who might be angry that they're there. Like, there's a way to imagine the urban environment as being quite challenging to negotiate as a coyote, I would think. But then learning that the research from the city of Chicago found that Chicago is a source population of coyotes for the surrounding rural areas. So they're actually much more successful within the city and dispersing out to the rural areas. Where in like a lot of the, again, farmland around here, they would be very often shot as pests. So that actually is maybe a more challenging or more sort of lethal environment for them than the city is. Sorry, I'm trying to come back to the original question, but I think the level of individual learning that it would take, and then passing that along, and sort of, for me, it's interesting to think about it as like a different coyote culture, maybe, or multi-species culture here in cities. I see your hand as well, Cooper.
Yeah, that point that rural areas might be more dangerous to coyotes is really important, I think, because it means that they're being pushed towards the city, um, and will just naturally occupy that space more. But it makes me wonder, I'm thinking about dependence and whether coyotes are dependent on the city for survival and food and, shelter and everything, or if they needed to leave the city and because they're on the margin of it, that maybe they have more opportunity to leave the city than humans do. So I guess my question is like, who's more dependent on the urban space? Who does the urban space matter more to?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think, my perception, I feel like why the information from Chicago was interesting to me is because, again, we might fall back on seeing sort of the natural place for animals like coyotes as being out in the more rural environments, and so that it kind of subverts that expectation. But I think you're right. What if like pressures were less? What if through whatever change might occur, there were like much less hunting, and they still get poisoned in rural areas as well, for sure. So if those sorts of pressures went away, would there be less pressure for them to be in urban environments? But I still think that there's like great resources and there's a reason why they do really well in the city as well. But your question makes me think. I'm thinking about the recent work on raccoons as well, that raccoons who have lived, for many generations in urban areas. This question of, are they actually sort of evolving a different skill set than more rural raccoons? And I think there's, some folks who are doing work in that area around how they problem solve in cities, and that they do end up possessing different skills, and could this actually be sort of different subspecies developing between urban versus rural raccoons? And so I don't know, I think that's an interesting question around like what happens when animals make their home in cities for a long time, and how might that change them or lead to different cultures or different even like evolutionary trajectories.
Yeah, I do have a related question. When it comes to street dogs in India, um, they were they primarily domesticated species, or is there a distinction or maybe a blurring of distinctions between domesticated and wild? Sounds like you're unmuted, or you're muted, Susan.
Anu, do you want to take that?
Go ahead if you want to. I raised my hand for a different question. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think at least I've noticed that sometimes in other parts of the world, dogs are abandoned and then they become street dogs, whereas in India, that's not the case. There seems to be a history of independently kind of arriving at being a street dog. But there are some people who try to trace lineage back to the village dog. But now there's been so much crossbreeding that the street dog is almost a kind of socio-biological category in itself.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to what Susan just said, there has been a line of scholarship which has advocated for making Indian cities street dog free, which takes as its main argument the fact that dogs were never meant to be on the streets. And so all the dogs that one sees on the street in India are descended from owned dogs in that sense, which were abandoned at some point of time. But there is no empirical evidence to support this. One distinction that one finds often is that owned dogs, pet dogs, so to speak, are likely to be pedigreed dogs, so to speak, and the street dogs are a different physiognomy altogether. I don't know how to describe it because I notice some kind of regional differences. If I go to North India, the street dogs look a little different from the street dogs in this part of the world. I'm in southern India now. So I do notice that in some parts of India, the street dogs are taller, sturdier, and in other parts, they are a little smaller build. There must be a reason behind this, which has not been explored. Because coming back again to the question of value, one has not really placed any value on street dogs, any intrinsic value, so to speak. And so they have not also been studied as a historical presence so much. Um, so it's really hard to say, but I would tend to agree with Susan. Um, uh, we can't really say that they are dogs that were abandoned or their descendants or a population springing from them. Um, and what I wanted to say to you, Lauren, was in continuation with the idea of boundaries, um, uh, connected to William's question about whether it is good or bad for coyotes to continue fearing humans. And you had said that, that you would tend to think of it not in terms of fear, but in terms of boundaries. And I was just thinking, regardless of whether we think of these boundaries in terms of adaptability or developing a new skill set or not, for all kinds of animal populations which were or continue to be thought of as wildlife, that has now started living in cities because of the degradation of forest lands, etc., etc. I I would tend to say that the distinction between nature and culture, if it ever existed, is so far back in the past that um, it doesn't really make sense to revive it at this point of time when we think about urban animals. Animals like coyotes in your article, foxes in cities, in European cities like Berlin, in London, there are thriving populations. I'm thinking also that there are bears that seem to be ransacking people's garbage bins in the US with some regularity. Um, I don't know. I would tend to think that these boundaries stopped being fixed a very long time ago, if they ever were fixed, if one ever had this clear-cut distinction between nature as the space for these animals and, the settled habitats of humans. Um, so how does one then think about these boundaries anymore, given the fact that they are constantly evolving and they will continue evolving, whether we want them to be or not? And if we think of urban planning, if we think of spaces and we design them keeping in mind that coyotes will be on that side of the boundary, even if we are sharing an urban scape with them, what are the chances that these boundaries are going to survive long enough for anything that we come up with in terms of policies, regulations, urban planning, uh, to make the whole project work? Because it's happening from both sides. It's happening from multiple sides, actually, the way, these boundaries are being negotiated, rethought.
Yeah, that is such a great question. And I think I have two initial thoughts. One of them is that, again, just very pragmatically, that boundaries aren't only in terms of space and, unique to the urban, your example of, bears, encounters with bears. I think that those boundaries are around the encounter. And it doesn't matter so much if we're in an urban environment or, a more rural, this idea of trying to minimize encounters because they can be potentially dangerous to humans and dangerous to the bears who are involved in that case, right? And so again, trying to understand just pragmatically, how do we not how do we diminish those amount of potentially negative encounters for both parties, and things like not having food sources in areas where there's going to be humans, again, whether that's at your like rural cabin or whether that's in the middle of the city, that's sort of seen as a way of kind of preventing negative encounters. So I think it's maybe more around the encounter itself and less around the space always, although people will talk about securing their property. So I guess it is, there's definitely ways that different spaces and understandings of space come into it there. But the second point I was going to make about coyotes in particular, and actually this applies to bears as well, and probably other species, is that what hasn't been central to our conversation yet is that we're talking, a lot of sort of how I've been speaking is this dyadic sort of interaction between like humans and coyotes, but the domestic dog is such a central figure in coexistence and conflict here. And so very often it's actually in terms of urban areas and the pragmatics of coexistence, it's not about boundaries between humans and coyotes, it's about boundaries between domestic dogs and coyotes, because that is the source of the conflict. And that is what often ends up being where these negative encounters, the site of these negative encounters. And so again, it's this question of, it is sort of a question of belonging and rights to space in the city. But just as an example, in the city that I'm living in now, there's one trail system where over several years there have been negative encounters, we'll say, between coyotes and domestic dogs, but it's always at a particular time of year. It is when they're denning. And so the city made a decision: we are closing this trail system to dogs during these months when coyotes are denning here. And so humans can still walk because coyotes are not going to be terribly bothered by a few humans strolling by. But if there is a dog coming into their area, that is a threat and they will respond. So sometimes it's, again, these boundaries between other species as well. And people have a real a lot of people here have a real hard time feeling like their domestic dog should be limited in the spaces that they can access or where they can go, where they can be off leash, things like that. And so, yeah, there is this challenging kind of like right to access space between domestic dogs and wildlife as well. And we'll see the same discourses um, around yeah, cats as well, cats being inside to protect wildlife and who should have sort of a right to that space. And it's just seeing William's question in the chat. Is it to protect the humans or the coyotes? It's to protect usually the dogs. Coyotes will bite dogs if they're coming into an area and they're protecting their pups. And then also subsequently the coyotes, because once a coyote has bitten a dog or two, usually they're deemed killable and they'll be killed. So it's very rarely humans who are at risk in these encounters. But that's not how things get, perceived. As soon as there's a negative encounter, then people are worried about their children and things like that. But yeah, anyway, I'd love to hear any other thoughts around that as well.
I just have one last question, Lauren, because I thought one of the really great insights from your article for me was that it's not the interactions between humans and coyotes shouldn't just be thought of in terms of encounters, but in terms of space times. And I don't think you answer this question, but you ask if we are to think about coexistence, should then animals be relocated to be active in the night? But even if we don't consider that extreme step, how can coexistence be also temporal or spatio-temporal?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of complexity there that I haven't, that, would benefit from the thinking of others as well. But I mean, again, this example that I've just given is, it's not, yeah, this one park, which was a site of heightened conflict. It's not, universal. It's only during, a month or two where their mobility is limited because there are pups there, right? And so there's like an intervention during that particular kind of very localized area, very localized time that can prevent negative encounters. And I think there's, I mean, even thinking about like I think we don't think about time as much, and some of the another example from the article is even things like road mortality and just being aware, like when we're driving during certain times of year, animals are dispersing, and then you add in like dusk coming earlier and that being out of sync with commuter traffic. And so understanding, and then you have daylight savings time where suddenly commuter traffic shifts 1 hour earlier or later. So all of the sort of knowledge that an animal might have accumulated over the last several months is no longer accurate in terms of when there's safety or danger. And so the more we can sort of think through how animals are experiencing the city in these space times, we can maybe have some more awareness, like these are not only the spaces where we need to be careful, we have signs of beware of wildlife, but like these are the times of year and the times of day during these times of year where we need to like be driving slower or being more cautious. And anyway, that's just one sort of example, but I think adding those sort of layers of complexity to thinking about how others experience the city, can help us to think towards ways of behaving that are less likely to have negative outcomes for other species.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's been such a great 1 hour to discuss your great essay and to think about some of these parallels between animals here and the coyotes there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was great connecting.
Bye.
Okay, take care.